How money quietly changed the world forever. Good evening. Welcome back. Tonight we're going to talk about something you use every single day. Something that shapes almost every decision you make. Something that built empires and tore them down. We're going to talk about money. Not in the way you might expect. We're not here to discuss economics or finance. We're here to understand how this simple invention changed human behavior forever. How it transformed the way we think, the way we organize ourselves, and the way we see each other. This is the story of money. A quiet story, a slow story, but perhaps the most important story of human civilization. Before money existed, let us begin in a time before money. Imagine, if you will, a world where the concept simply did not exist. No coins jingling in pockets. No paper bills folded in wallets. No numbers glowing on screens. Just people living in small groups, surviving day by day. This was the world of our ancestors. Tens of thousands of years ago, humans lived in bands of perhaps 20 to 50 individuals. They hunted animals. They gathered plants. They moved from place to place, following the seasons, following the food. And they shared what they had. If you killed a deer, you shared the meat with your group. Not because of morality, exactly, but because it made practical sense. Meat spoils quickly in the heat. You cannot eat an entire deer before it rots. So you give some to your neighbor. Tomorrow, when they find honey or catch fish, they will remember. They will share with you. This was not trade in the way we understand it today. There were no negotiations. No one said, "I will give you 3 fish for that stone tool." Instead, there was a kind of informal accounting that existed in memory and social bonds. You helped others. Others helped you. The group survived together. Life was simple in some ways. There were no rich people, no poor people. Everyone had roughly the same amount of material possessions, which is to say, almost nothing. A few tools, some animal skins for clothing, perhaps a necklace made of shells or teeth, but nothing more. You owned what you could carry because you were always moving. And in this world, the concept of wealth as we know it could not exist. You could not accumulate. You could not save for the future in any meaningful way. You lived in the present, surrounded by your family, your tribe. Your wealth was your relationships. Your knowledge of where to find food. Your standing in the group. This way of life persisted for thousands upon thousands of years. The archaeological evidence shows us that hunter-gatherer societies were remarkably egalitarian. When researchers examine the dwelling sites of these ancient peoples, they find that houses are all roughly the same size. There are no palaces, no hovels, just simple structures, similar to one another. Some anthropologists call this aggressive egalitarianism. It was not that everyone was equal by accident. It was that these societies actively prevented inequality from emerging. If someone tried to accumulate too much, tried to claim authority over others, they would be mocked, ostracized, or even expelled from the group. The community enforced fairness through social pressure. But this way of life contained within it the seeds of its own transformation. And that transformation would begin with a simple innovation. An innovation that seems almost inevitable in hindsight, yet changed everything. That innovation was agriculture. Around 12,000 years ago, in different parts of the world, humans began to settle down. They began to plant crops, to tend fields, to domesticate animals. This happened independently in several regions. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, people grew wheat and barley. In China, they grew rice and millet. In Mesoamerica, they grew maize and beans. Agriculture changed the fundamental equation of human existence. For the first time, you could produce more food than you needed to survive. You could have a surplus. And with surplus came storage. Granaries were built to hold wheat through the winter. Pots were created to store oil and wine. The concept of saving for the future became possible. But agriculture also created a problem. The problem of inequality. When everyone is moving constantly, you cannot accumulate wealth. But when people settle in one place, when they build houses and clear fields, some land is better than others. Some families work harder or have more children to help in the fields. Over time, some people have more. Others have less. The egalitarian world of the hunter-gatherers began to fracture. And it was in this new world of agricultural settlements that the problems of exchange became apparent. The problems that would eventually give birth to money. The problem with barter. Picture this. You are a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia, around 5,000 years ago. You have just harvested your barley. Sacks and sacks of grain, more than your family can eat. You need other things. You need a new clay pot to store the grain. You need sandals because yours have worn through. Maybe you want some dates or figs for variety in your diet. So you take some of your barley to the market in the nearest town. You look for the potter. You find him and you say, "I would like to trade my barley for one of your pots." The potter looks at you and shakes his head. "I do not need barley," he says. "I already have plenty from last week's harvest. What I need is leather to repair my roof." You do not have leather. You only have barley. So you must find someone who has leather and wants barley. You wander the market. You find a leather worker. "Will you trade leather for barley?" you ask. The leather worker considers this. "How much barley?" he asks. And here you encounter another problem. How much barley is a piece of leather worth? There is no standard. You must negotiate. You must haggle. The leather worker says one amount. You counter with another. Back and forth. Minutes pass. Maybe you reach an agreement. Maybe you do not. But wait. Even if you get the leather, you must now return to the potter. But by the time you find him again, perhaps he has already traded for the leather he needed. Perhaps he has left the market. Or perhaps he still needs leather, but now he also wants oil, not barley. This is the problem with barter. Economists call it the double coincidence of wants. For a trade to happen, Both people must want what the other has at the same time, in the same place. And they must agree on the relative value of the items. When societies are small, when everyone knows everyone, barter can work. If there are only 50 people in your village, you know that the smith needs grain, the weaver needs tools, the farmer needs cloth. Exchanges happen naturally over time. You have a sense of who owes what to whom. The accounting exists in memory and social obligation. But as societies grow, as towns become cities, as cities become kingdoms, this system breaks down. You cannot remember what you owe to hundreds of people. You cannot spend your whole day walking around trying to find someone who has what you need and wants what you have. Trade becomes slow, frustrating, inefficient, and inefficiency is a kind of poverty. When it takes you all day to trade your grain for a pot, that is a day you are not working in your field. That is a day of lost productivity. Multiply this across thousands of people, and you can see how the lack of a medium of exchange becomes a drag on an entire society. Moreover, some things cannot be divided in barter. Imagine you have a cow, and you want to trade it for grain. But the amount of grain equal to a cow's value is more than you can carry. Or imagine you want to buy something small, like a single loaf of bread. You cannot trade 1/100th of a cow for a loaf of bread. The cow is indivisible. And so, people began to search for solutions. They began to think about items that could serve as a kind of universal trade good. Something that everyone would accept. Something that could be divided into smaller units. Something that could be stored without spoiling. Different cultures tried different things. In some places, cattle were used as a measure of value. The Latin word for money, pecunia, comes from pecus, meaning cattle. In other places, shells were used. Cowrie shells were particularly popular across Africa and Asia, small and durable and beautiful. Some societies used salt, so valuable it was literally worth its weight in silver. The word salary comes from the Latin word for salt. But these commodity monies had their own problems. Cattle die. Shells can break. Salt can dissolve in rain. And more importantly, these items have intrinsic value. If everyone decides they want to use cattle as money, there is suddenly more demand for cattle, which drives up their price in terms of other goods, which creates confusion and instability. What people needed was something else. Something rare enough to be valuable, durable enough to last, portable enough to carry, divisible enough to make small transactions, and ideally, something that had little use beyond being money, so its value would remain stable. What they needed was metal, the birth of money. Gold and silver had been known to humans for thousands of years. These metals occur naturally in the earth, sometimes in pure form, glittering in stream beds or exposed in rock faces. They are beautiful. They catch the light. They do not tarnish or rust. For these reasons, ancient peoples made them into jewelry, into ornaments for the wealthy and powerful. But sometime around the 3rd millennium BCE, People in the ancient world began to realize that these metals could serve another purpose. They could serve as a medium of exchange. Gold and silver had many of the properties that make for good money. They are rare, which makes them valuable. They are durable, lasting essentially forever. They are portable, especially when worked into small pieces. They are divisible. A gold bar can be melted and recast into smaller units. And crucially, while they can be made into jewelry, they have limited practical use beyond that. You cannot eat gold. You cannot build a house with silver. Their value lies primarily in what others will accept them for. At first, pieces of metal were simply weighed out for each transaction. A merchant would have a scale and a set of standardized weights. When you wanted to buy something, the merchant would place the item on one side of the scale and add metal to the other side until they balanced. This was better than pure barter, but it still had problems. It was slow. Every transaction required weighing, and there was always the risk of fraud. A dishonest person might mix cheaper metals with the gold or silver, passing off bronze as something more valuable. And so, a revolutionary idea emerged. What if someone in authority, someone trusted, would guarantee the weight and purity of pieces of metal? What if these pieces were standardized, so you did not have to weigh them every time? What if they were marked with a seal or image that said, "This piece is genuine"? This idea led to the invention of the coin. The first coins in history were struck in the ancient kingdom of Lydia, located in what is now Western Turkey, around 630 BC. The Lydians lived at a crossroads of trade, connecting the Greek world with the kingdoms of the East. They had access to a natural alloy called electrum, a mixture of gold and silver that was found in the rivers flowing from the mountains. Someone, we do not know exactly who, had a brilliant idea. Take lumps of this electrum, standardize their weight, then stamp them with an official mark using a hard die. The earliest Lydian coins show the image of a lion, the symbol of the ruling dynasty. This stamp was a guarantee. It said, "This piece of metal is authentic. It weighs what it should weigh. It contains the metals it claims to contain. You can trust it." This simple innovation changed everything. For the first time in history, money became truly portable and standardized. You did not need to weigh coins in every transaction. You did not need to test them for purity. You could simply count them. 5 coins, 10 coins, 100 coins. The transaction became fast, efficient, trustworthy. The invention spread rapidly. The Greeks adopted it. The Persians adopted it. Within a few generations, coined money was being used across the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Cities began to mint their own coins, stamped with their own symbols. Athens produced silver coins with an owl. Corinth produced coins with a winged horse. The coin became not just a tool of commerce, but a symbol of civic identity and power. And with the spread of coined money, trade exploded. Merchants could travel long distances, confident that their coins would be accepted in far-off markets. Goods moved more freely. Cities grew. specialization increased. A person could focus on being a potter and trade their pots for everything else they needed, rather than having to grow their own food, make their own clothes, and build their own house. But coins were just the beginning. Over the following centuries, money continued to evolve, continued to change form, adapting to the needs of different societies. And with each evolution, money became more abstract, more removed from physical objects, until eventually it would become little more than numbers written in ledgers or displayed on screens. In China, during the Song dynasty in the 11th century CE, a new form of money appeared: paper money. The Chinese economy had grown so large and complex that the weight of bronze coins became a burden. Merchants traveling long distances would have to carry thousands of coins, which was slow and dangerous. So the government began issuing promissory notes, pieces of paper that represented a claim on metal coins stored in government treasuries. At first, these notes could be redeemed for coins on demand. But over time, people realized that as long as everyone trusted the government to honor the notes, there was no need to actually redeem them. The paper itself became money. This was a radical abstraction. Money was no longer a physical substance with inherent value. It was a promise, a symbol, an agreement. The West would not adopt paper money for many more centuries, not until the 17th century, and even then with great skepticism. But the principle was the same. Money was becoming less about the thing itself and more about what it represented. And so we see the arc of money's evolution, from shells and salt and cattle, to weighed metals, to standardized coins, to paper notes, and eventually, in our own time, to digital entries in computer databases. Each step making money more abstract, more efficient, more powerful. But the invention of money did not simply make trade easier. It did something far more profound. It changed the very structure of human society. It created new forms of power, new forms of inequality, new ways for humans to relate to one another. And that is where our story truly begins. Money creates power. Before money, power in human societies was personal and direct. A chief was powerful because he was strong, or wise, or charismatic. He led by example. He earned loyalty through his deeds. Power flowed from the individual. But money changed this equation entirely. With money came a new form of power. Economic power, the power to command the labor and resources of others, not through personal charisma or physical strength, but through the abstract medium of currency. Consider what happens when money enters a society. Suddenly, a king does not need to personally convince warriors to follow him into battle. He can pay them. He can offer coins in exchange for their service. The relationship becomes transactional. And more importantly, it becomes scalable. A king with money can hire 1,000 soldiers, 10,000 soldiers, people he has never met, people from distant lands who do not even speak his language. As long as he has enough coins, he can command their loyalty. Personal relationships become irrelevant. What matters is the size of the treasury. This is how money creates power. And the first people to understand this, to truly exploit this mechanism, were the rulers of the ancient world. In ancient Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in China, the rise of powerful kingdoms coincides almost exactly with the rise of systematic taxation. Kings learned that they could collect a portion of the wealth of their subjects, usually in the form of grain or other goods, and store it in royal warehouses. Then they could redistribute this wealth to soldiers, to priests, to administrators. They could feed an army, build a palace, construct temples and monuments that would proclaim their glory for generations. Taxation is essentially a way of converting the labor of many into the power of one. A farmer grows grain. The king takes a portion of that grain as tax. The king gives that grain to a soldier. The soldier fights for the king. The farmer's labor has been transformed through the medium of taxation into military power. This was revolutionary. Before taxation, if you wanted power, you needed to personally lead and inspire. You needed to be exceptional. But with taxation you could buy power. And the more you taxed, the more powerful you became. Of course, there were limits. Tax too much and people starve. Tax too much and they rebel. But within those limits, kings learned to extract enormous amounts of wealth from their subjects. And with coined money, this system became even more efficient. Instead of collecting grain and storing it in warehouses where it might rot, kings could collect coins. Coins do not spoil. They can be stored indefinitely. They can be transported easily. A single locked chest can hold wealth equal to a granary full of wheat. Moreover, coins allowed kings to engage in long-distance trade. A king in Egypt could send gold coins to Greece to buy timber for ships. A king in Persia could send silver coins to India to buy spices and jewels. Money became not just a tool of internal control, but a tool of international power. The Roman Empire is perhaps the greatest example of how money creates power. At its height, Rome controlled territories from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Mesopotamia. Millions of people speaking dozens of languages, all brought under one rule. How was this possible? The answer, in large part, is money. Rome minted vast quantities of silver coins, called denarii. These coins were used throughout the empire to pay soldiers, to buy supplies, to collect taxes. A legion stationed in distant Britain would be paid in denarii. They would use those denarii to buy food and goods from local merchants. The merchants would use those denarii to pay their taxes to Rome. And the cycle would continue. This monetary system bound the empire together more effectively than any amount of military force alone. As long as people everywhere accepted Roman coins, as long as those coins held their value, the empire functioned. But when the empire began to debase its currency, mixing base metals with silver to stretch the money supply, inflation set in. Prices rose. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Taxes had to increase. And the whole system began to wobble and eventually collapse. Money also enabled a new form of power that we now take for granted: the ability to preserve wealth across generations. Before money, wealth was mostly in the form of land, animals, and goods. These could be passed down to children, but they had limits. Land must be worked. Animals must be tended. Goods decay. But money can sit in a vault for decades, for centuries, unchanged. A wealthy merchant could accumulate gold coins throughout his life and pass them to his son, who would be born wealthy not through any effort of his own, but simply through inheritance. This created something new in human society: dynasties of wealth that persisted across time. And so we see how money transforms power. It makes power impersonal, scalable, and heritable. A king can command armies he never meets. A merchant can become rich without ever touching the goods he trades. And a child can be born into privilege, destined for wealth before they take their first breath. This is one of money's most profound effects. It separates power from the personal. In a world without money, you are powerful because of who you are. In a world with money, you are powerful because of what you have. And what you have is measured in coins, in currency, in numbers written in ledgers. Power becomes abstract, quantifiable, transferable. But of course, not everyone benefits equally from this new system. For every person who accumulates wealth, there are many who do not. For every king commanding an army, there are thousands of soldiers following orders. Money does not just create power, it creates inequality. And it is this inequality that brings us to perhaps money's most troubling legacy. Money changes human behavior. Before we discuss inequality, let us talk about something more intimate, more personal. Let us talk about how money changes the way people think and behave. There is a famous thought experiment in philosophy. Imagine you are walking along a riverbank and you see a child drowning. Do you jump in to save them? Most people say yes, without hesitation. Even if it means ruining your expensive shoes or getting your clothes wet, you would save the child. Because a human life is worth more than any material possession. Now imagine that instead of a drowning child, you see an advertisement for a charity that saves children's lives in distant countries. For the price of your expensive shoes, you could provide mosquito nets that would save multiple children from malaria. Do you donate? Most people do not. The same person who would not hesitate to save a drowning child in front of them will walk past that charity advertisement without a second thought. But the answer has something to do with how money changes our emotional relationship to value. The drowning child is immediate, visceral, real. The distant children are abstract, represented by numbers in a brochure. Money has a way of creating emotional distance. This is just one small example of money's psychological effects. But it hints at a much larger truth. Money fundamentally changes human behavior in ways we are only beginning to understand. Consider the act of saving. In a world without money, you cannot really save for the future beyond storing some grain for the winter. But with money, saving becomes a life strategy. You accumulate coins, slowly over years. You forego pleasures today in hopes of security tomorrow. This creates a new psychological orientation, a delayed gratification, a focus on the future rather than the present. Some people embrace this. They become savers, hoarders, misers. They find pleasure in watching their wealth grow. Others do the opposite. They spend freely, living in the moment, finding the idea of saving joyless and pointless. And so money creates a division in human personality that barely existed before. The saver and the spender, the careful and the reckless, the prudent and the hedonistic. Entire moral frameworks develop around these differences. Some cultures praise thrift and frugality. Others celebrate generosity and display. Money also creates new forms of ambition. In a world without money, what can you aspire to? You can aspire to be the best hunter in your tribe, the wisest elder, the most respected member of the community. But there is a ceiling to such ambitions. At a certain point, you have achieved all that can be achieved within your small social world. But with money, ambition becomes limitless. No matter how much you have, you can always have more. The merchant with one ship dreams of owning two. The king with one kingdom dreams of conquering another. Money creates an infinite ladder of wealth, and people spend their lives climbing it, never reaching the top because there is no top. This is not to say that ambition is bad. Ambition has driven many of humanity's greatest achievements. But it is to say that money channels ambition in a particular direction, toward accumulation, toward more. And this can become consuming. It can become an end in itself, rather than a means to something else. Money also changes social relationships in subtle ways. In a moneyless society, you are tied to your community through bonds of reciprocity and mutual obligation. You help your neighbor because someday you might need their help. You share because you are part of a web of relationships. But with money, these bonds loosen. If you need help, you can hire someone. You do not need to rely on your neighbor's goodwill. You do not need to be part of a community at all. You can live alone as long as you have money. The hermit with gold is free in a way that the tribesman is not. This can be liberating. It frees you from the judgment of your neighbors, from the pressure to conform to community norms. But it can also be isolating. In a monetized society, loneliness becomes possible in a way it was not before. You can have all the money in the world and still feel utterly alone. There is also the question of morality. Many ancient religions and philosophies struggled with money. They saw in it something dangerous. The love of money, they warned, is the root of evil. Not money itself, but the love of it. The way it can warp your values, make you selfish, cruel, greedy. The Greeks had a concept called pleonexia, the insatiable desire for more. They saw this as a vice, a sickness of the soul. But they also recognized that money seemed to inflame this vice more than anything else. A person who would be content with 2 loaves of bread might never be content with their wealth, no matter how much they accumulated. Why does money have this effect? Perhaps because it is abstract. It is not bread or land or jewels. It is pure potential. Money is the ability to get anything you want, and so the desire for money becomes the desire for everything. It becomes boundless. And yet, for all these psychological complexities, perhaps the most important thing money does to human behavior is this. It makes everything commensurable. It gives everything a price. Before money, how do you compare the value of a cow to the value of a pot? They are different things, incomparable. But with money, both can be expressed in a single unit. The cow is worth 10 coins. The pot is worth 1 coin. Therefore, the cow is worth 10 pots. Everything can be reduced to numbers. Everything can be compared. This has tremendous practical benefits for trade and exchange. But it also has a darker side. Once everything has a price, everything becomes tradable. Your labor has a price. Your time has a price. Your dignity, your honor, even your children might have a price if the society allows it. This commodification of life is one of money's most profound and disturbing effects. It reduces the sacred to the secular, the priceless to the priced. And once this mental shift occurs, it is very difficult to reverse. And so we see that money is not neutral. It is not simply a tool. It is a technology that reshapes human psychology, human relationships, human morality. It creates new virtues and new vices, new freedoms and new forms of slavery. It is, in many ways, the defining innovation of civilization. But if money changes individuals, it changes societies even more. It reorganizes entire civilizations, creating hierarchies and institutions that would be impossible without it. And that brings us to the grand structures that money built. Money builds cities and civilizations. Walk through the ruins of ancient cities and you are walking through monuments to money. The temples of Athens, the aqueducts of Rome, the Great Wall of China. These were not built by individuals. They were built by societies that had learned to concentrate and direct vast amounts of wealth through the medium of currency. Money made large-scale organization possible. Before money, if you wanted to build something big, you needed to convince people to work together voluntarily or coerce them through force. But money provided a third option. You could pay them, and payment created a relationship that was neither fully voluntary nor fully coercive. It was contractual. A king could say to 1,000 workers, "Build me a pyramid, and I will give each of you 1 sack of grain per week." The workers, needing to feed their families, would agree. They would work not out of love for the king, not out of fear of violence, but out of economic necessity. And so the pyramid would rise, stone by stone, grain by grain. This economic organization allowed ancient civilizations to accomplish things that seem barely possible even with modern technology. The construction of the pyramids required moving millions of tons of stone, some blocks weighing several tons each, using only human labor and simple tools. The answer is organization. Thousands of workers, fed and paid by the state, working in coordinated shifts year after year. Money made this coordination possible. Cities, too, are fundamentally economic structures. A city is a place where people come together to specialize and trade. A farmer cannot live in a city because there are no fields. A smith cannot live in isolation because they need to trade their tools for food. But in a city, the farmer can sell grain to the smith, and the smith can sell tools to the farmer, and both can thrive. And what makes this possible? Money. It is the medium through which all these specialized trades flow. The merchant brings spices from distant lands and sells them for coins. The baker uses those coins to buy flour. The miller who sells flour uses the coins to pay the carpenter for a new wheel. The carpenter uses the coins to buy bread. Around and around the money flows, and the city hums with activity. The first true cities arose in Mesopotamia, around 3500 BC. Cities like Uruk, Uar, and Babylon. These were not just large villages. They were complex hierarchical societies with thousands of inhabitants, temples, palaces, markets, and craftsmen of every kind. And they were held together by systems of taxation, payment, and trade, all mediated through money or money-like instruments. Money also enabled long-distance trade networks that connected different civilizations. The Silk Road, which stretched from China to the Mediterranean, was essentially a chain of monetary exchanges. A merchant in China would buy silk with Chinese coins. They would travel westward, trading the silk for Roman coins. Another merchant would take those Roman coins further west. At each step, goods and money changed hands, and wealth flowed across continents. These trade routes were more than just economic arteries. They were channels for the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultures. Buddhism spread from India to China along the Silk Road. Paper and gunpowder traveled from China to the West. Greek philosophy influenced Islamic thought, which in turn influenced medieval Europe. All of this cross-pollination was made possible by the economic connections that trade created. And trade at this scale required money. Money also led to the development of new institutions. Banks, for example. The first banks appeared in ancient Mesopotamia around 2000 BC. Temples acted as repositories for valuables, storing grain and precious metals. They would lend these resources to merchants and farmers, charging interest on the loans. This was banking in its most primitive form, but the principles were the same as modern banking, taking deposits, making loans, earning profit from interest. These early banks played a crucial role in economic development. A farmer could borrow seed grain in the spring, plant it, harvest the crop in the fall, and repay the loan with interest. This allowed the farmer to plant more than they could have afforded on their own, increasing productivity. A merchant could borrow money to finance a trading expedition, buy goods in one place, sell them in another, and repay the loan from the profits. Without these financial institutions, economic growth would have been much slower. Money, channeled through banks, allowed people to invest in the future, to take risks, to expand beyond what they could afford with their own resources. This is the power of credit, and it has been a driving force of civilization for 4,000 years. But money also built something else, something less tangible but perhaps more important. It built the idea of the state itself. Think about what a state is. It is an organization that claims authority over a territory and the people within it. But how does it maintain that authority? Partly through military force, yes, but mostly through its ability to extract resources from the population through taxation and then redistribute those resources in ways that benefit the state. A state needs an army to defend its borders. It pays that army with taxes collected from farmers and merchants. A state needs administrators to collect those taxes and enforce its laws. It pays those administrators with taxes. A state needs to build roads and aqueducts and granaries. It finances those projects with taxes. The state is, in essence, a machine for collecting and redistributing wealth. And money is the fuel that makes the machine run. Without money, states would be much weaker and smaller. They would be limited by their ability to organize labor directly, which is difficult and inefficient. But with money, a state can reach into every corner of its territory, extract a portion of wealth, and use that wealth to consolidate its power. And so we see that money is not just an economic tool. It is a political one. The invention of money is inseparable from the invention of the state. They evolved together, each reinforcing the other. The state minted coins and guaranteed their value. The coins enabled the state to tax and spend. And the cycle continued, building ever larger, more complex political structures. By the time we reach the great empires of the ancient world, Rome, Han China, Persia, we are looking at civilizations that controlled millions of people and vast territories. And all of them relied on sophisticated monetary systems to function. They minted coins, collected taxes, paid soldiers, financed public works. Money was the invisible architecture that held these empires together. But as we have seen again and again, money is a double-edged sword. It builds, but it also destroys. And that brings us to the darker side of money's influence on civilization. The dark side of money. For every pyramid built with money, there is a story of those who suffered to build it. For every merchant who grew rich through trade, there are laborers who worked for pittance. Money creates winners and losers. And often, the losers pay a terrible price. Let us talk about debt. Debt is as old as money itself. In ancient Mesopotamia, farmers would borrow grain to plant their fields. If the harvest was good, they would repay the loan with interest. But if the harvest failed, due to drought or flood or locusts, they could not repay. The debt would carry over to the next year. Interest would accumulate, and if they still could not repay, they faced a terrible choice. They could sell themselves or their family members into slavery to pay the debt. Debt slavery was common throughout the ancient world. A free person could become enslaved not through conquest in war, but simply through bad luck and the inexorable mathematics of compound interest. In ancient Athens, in Republican Rome, in the kingdoms of the Near East, debtors who could not pay were reduced to the status of property. This was so common, so socially destabilizing, that some rulers recognized it as a problem. In Babylon, King Hammurabi's law code included provisions to limit debt slavery. Debtors could only be enslaved for 3 years before being freed. Other Mesopotamian kings periodically declared debt jubilees, canceling all debts and freeing debt slaves. These were acts of political necessity. If too many people fell into debt slavery, the pool of free farmers who could be taxed and conscripted into the army would shrink. The state itself would weaken. But debt jubilees were rare and unpredictable. Most of the time, debt was enforced ruthlessly, and the threat of debt hung over the poor like a sword. One bad harvest, one illness, one stroke of misfortune, and you could lose everything. You could lose your freedom. Money also enabled more conventional forms of slavery to flourish. In a world without money, slavery is limited. You must feed and house your slaves, and you can only own as many as you can personally oversee. But with money, slavery becomes industrialized. You can buy slaves from distant lands using coins. You can put them to work in mines or on plantations. You can sell their labor to others. Slavery becomes a business, a commodity market. The Roman Empire's economy was built on slavery. Millions of people, captured in wars or sold by traders, worked in fields, in mines, in households. They were bought and sold like cattle. Their price was determined by the market, by supply and demand. A young healthy male might be worth 50 denarii. An educated Greek slave who could teach or keep accounts might be worth 200. A child might be worth 10. This is what money does. It reduces human beings to numbers, to prices. And once something has a price, it can be traded, bought, owned. Of course, slavery existed before money. But money made it more efficient, more widespread, more brutal. It turned slavery from a relationship of personal domination into an economic system. The slave owner did not need to know the slave personally. They were simply an investment, measured in coins, expected to produce a return. Money also funded wars. Before money, wars were limited in scale. A king could call up his warriors for a campaign, but they needed to return home for the harvest. Armies were seasonal, but with money, a king could hire professional soldiers who fought year-round. He could buy weapons and supplies from distant lands. He could besiege a city for months or years, keeping his army fed and paid. The scale of violence increased dramatically. The ancient world saw wars of unprecedented destruction. The Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta lasted nearly 30 years and devastated Greece. The Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage killed hundreds of thousands. These were not tribal skirmishes. They were industrial conflicts, fueled by the ability of states to convert economic resources into military power through the medium of money. And consider what happens when a state runs out of money during a war. It cannot simply stop. It has committed itself. It has made promises to soldiers and suppliers. So what does it do? It borrows. It goes into debt. And if it cannot borrow enough, it does something even more desperate. It debases the currency. Debasement is a quiet form of theft. The state takes its coins, melts them down, and remints them with less precious metal, mixing in cheaper metals like copper or tin. The coins look the same, but they contain less gold or silver. The state can now make more coins from the same amount of metal. It uses these coins to pay its debts. But people are not stupid. They notice that the coins are lighter, less pure. They lose faith in the currency. Merchants raise their prices. What once cost 1 coin now costs 2, then 5, then 10. This is inflation. And when inflation spirals out of control, it can destroy an economy. Of course, this works only as long as not everyone tries to withdraw their deposits at once. If depositors lose faith and demand their money back simultaneously, the bank cannot pay. It collapses. This is called a bank run, and it has been a recurring disaster throughout financial history. The European banking system grew more sophisticated over the centuries. The Bank of Amsterdam, founded in 1609, became one of the first central banks. It held deposits for merchants and governments. It issued notes that circulated as currency. It helped finance Dutch trade and military expeditions. The Netherlands, a small country with few natural resources, became one of the richest nations in Europe through the power of its financial system. Then came the Bank of England, founded in 1694. This institution would become the model for central banking worldwide. It was created to solve a problem. King William III needed money to fight a war against France, but he had already borrowed heavily and lenders were reluctant to lend more. So a group of merchants proposed a deal. They would lend the king £1.2 million, a massive sum. In return, they would be granted a charter to operate as a bank, accepting deposits and issuing notes. The Bank of England's notes were not immediately legal tender, but because they were backed by the government's promise to repay the loan, they were trusted. People began to accept them as money. And crucially, the bank could issue more notes than it had gold reserves, as long as it maintained enough gold to redeem the notes that were actually presented for redemption. This is called fractional reserve banking, and it remains the basis of modern banking. What this meant was that the Bank of England was creating money, not by mining gold or minting coins, but simply by issuing paper notes backed by the promise of future redemption. Money had become even more abstract. It was no longer tied to a physical commodity in a 1-to-1 ratio. It was tied to trust, to faith in institutions. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, this system spread across Europe and to the Americas. Banks proliferated. Paper money became common. Gold and silver coins remained in circulation, but increasingly, Everyday transactions were conducted with banknotes. And with this abstraction came new vulnerabilities. Financial crises became more frequent and more devastating. The South Sea Bubble in England in 1720. The Mississippi Bubble in France around the same time. These were speculative manias where the prices of certain investments soared to absurd heights, driven by easy credit and irrational optimism, and then crashed catastrophically. Fortunes were made and lost overnight. The economy lurched from boom to bust. But there was no going back. The world had become too complex, trade too widespread, for a purely metallic currency system. Paper money, despite its dangers, was here to stay. And it would only become more abstract still, because even paper money was still a physical object. You could hold it. You could hide it under your mattress. But the next evolution of money would eliminate even that physical presence. Money would become invisible. Numbers in ledgers. Bits in computers. Pure information. But before we reach that point, let us step back and consider what had been lost in this transformation. Because along with the convenience of paper money came a subtle but profound change in how people related to wealth. When money was gold, there was a limit to how much could exist. Gold had to be dug from the earth. It was finite. But when money became paper, the only limit was trust. A government could print as much money as it wanted, as long as people still believed in it. And this meant that the value of money could be manipulated. Governments could inflate the currency to pay their debts. They could deflate it to favor creditors. Money became a tool of policy, not just a medium of exchange. And ordinary people, who depended on money for their survival, were at the mercy of these policies. A lifetime of savings could evaporate in a wave of inflation. A debt that seemed manageable could become crushing in a period of deflation. The abstraction of money made it more efficient, but also more dangerous. Still, the world economy grew. Trade expanded. New technologies emerged, and money, in its ever more abstract forms, was the lubricant that made it all possible. Modern money, numbers on screens. Now we arrive at the world we know. The world where money is no longer metal or paper, but increasingly just numbers. Numbers displayed on screens. Numbers in databases. Money that exists only as information. This transformation began gradually. For most of the 20th century, paper money and coins were still the primary form of currency for everyday transactions. But behind the scenes, the financial system was already moving toward digital abstraction. Banks began using computers in the 1950s and 1960s to track accounts and process transactions. Instead of ledgers written by hand, information was stored on magnetic tape and punch cards. When you deposited a check, the bank would update your account balance in their computer. The money did not physically move. The numbers simply changed. Credit cards emerged in the 1950s and became widespread by the 1970s. These cards allowed you to make purchases without cash. The merchant would imprint your card details, and later, The transactions would be processed and the amounts transferred between accounts. This was convenient, but it also marked another step in money's abstraction. You were no longer handing over currency. You were authorizing the movement of numbers. By the 1990s, with the rise of the Internet, online banking became possible. You could check your balance, transfer money between accounts, pay bills, all from a computer in your home. And then came online shopping. You could buy goods from the other side of the world with a few clicks. The money would move instantly or near instantly through a network of electronic transfers. Today, a significant portion of money exists only in digital form. When you receive your salary, it is deposited electronically into your bank account. When you buy groceries, you tap a card or your phone, and the money is deducted. You may go days, even weeks, without touching physical cash. And the truth is, most money has always been somewhat abstract. Even when everyone used gold coins, the total amount of money in an economy was far greater than the physical gold. Because of lending and fractional reserve banking, banks created money that exceeded the actual reserves. The gold was a base, but credit built upon it. But in the digital age, this abstraction has reached its ultimate form. Money is now information. It is bits in a computer. And this has profound implications. On the one hand, digital money is incredibly efficient. Transactions that once took days or weeks now happen in seconds. You can send money to someone on the other side of the world almost instantly. Businesses can operate globally with ease. The friction of distance has been nearly eliminated. On the other hand, digital money is more vulnerable to certain kinds of problems. If the computer system fails, if there is a cyber attack, if the power goes out, your money becomes inaccessible. It exists in theory, but you cannot use it. You are dependent on infrastructure, on technology, on institutions remaining functional. Digital money also makes surveillance easier. Every transaction leaves a record. Governments and corporations can track how you spend your money, where you spend it, what you buy. In a cash economy, you could make anonymous purchases. In a digital economy, everything is traceable. This has benefits for law enforcement and taxation, but it also raises concerns about privacy and freedom. And then there is the question of who controls the system. In the past, if you had gold coins, you controlled your own wealth. You could hide them, trade them. No one could take them without physically taking them from you. But digital money exists in accounts controlled by banks and governments. If your account is frozen, if access is denied, your money is gone. You cannot touch it. You cannot use it. Your wealth exists only because institutions say it does. This became starkly apparent during financial crises. In Cyprus in 2013, banks froze accounts and imposed capital controls. People could not withdraw their own money. In Greece during the debt crisis, ATMs were limited and capital controls prevented people from moving money out of the country. The money existed on paper, but it was trapped. And yet, for most people, most of the time, the digital money system works. It is convenient. It is fast. It enables a level of economic activity that would be impossible with physical currency alone. The global economy now runs on digital money. Trillions of dollars, euros, yen, yuan, moving through fiber optic cables at the speed of light. Some have even begun to question whether we need banks and governments at all. The invention of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin in 2009 proposed a radical alternative: money that exists purely as digital code, maintained not by any central authority but by a distributed network of computers. Cryptocurrency is money without borders, without banks, without government control. At least, that is the vision. Whether cryptocurrencies will truly replace traditional money remains to be seen. They have their own problems, their own vulnerabilities. But they represent the logical endpoint of money's evolution toward abstraction. Pure information, pure code, money as mathematics. And so we see that money, which began as shells and stones and lumps of metal, has become something almost entirely immaterial. It exists in our collective agreement that it has value. It exists in the electronic pulses of computers. It exists in the faith we place in institutions and systems. This is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about money. It has no inherent value. It is worth something only because we all agree it is worth something. And that agreement, that collective fiction, is what allows civilization to function. But this collective fiction is fragile. It depends on trust. And when trust breaks down, money collapses. We have seen this happen repeatedly throughout history. Hyperinflation in Weimar Germany in the 1920s, where people needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy a loaf of bread. Hyperinflation in Zimbabwe in the 2000s, where the currency became so worthless that they printed $100 trillion notes. These are examples of what happens when faith in money dies. And in our modern, interconnected digital economy, the potential for catastrophic failure is greater than ever. A crisis in one country can spread globally within hours. A cyber attack on financial infrastructure could paralyze the economy. The complexity of the system has made it powerful, but also fragile. And yet we continue. We wake up each day and go to work, earning numbers in a computer. We buy things, transferring numbers from our account to someone else's. We save, watching numbers grow. We invest, hoping numbers will grow faster. Our entire lives revolve around these numbers, these abstractions, this collective fiction called money. And perhaps that is the ultimate testament to money's power. It has become so central to human existence that we cannot imagine life without it. We have built our entire civilization on this foundation. And whatever problems it creates, whatever inequalities it perpetuates, whatever crises it precipitates, we cannot go back. We can only go forward, deeper into the abstraction, hoping that the trust that holds it all together does not break. Why money changed the world forever? And so we reach the end of our journey through the history of money. We have traveled from the barter economies of ancient villages to the digital currencies of the modern age. We have seen how money evolved from shells to gold to paper to numbers on screens. We have explored how it created power, how it changed behavior, how it built civilizations and sometimes destroyed them. Now let us step back and ask the fundamental question: why did money change the world forever? The answer, at its core, is this: money is the ultimate social technology. It is a tool that allows people who do not know each other, who do not trust each other, who may not even speak the same language, to cooperate and exchange value. It is the foundation upon which all complex civilization rests. Before money, cooperation was limited by personal relationships. You could trade with people you knew. You could work together with your tribe. But beyond that small circle, coordination was nearly impossible. Strangers were dangerous. Trust was rare. But money changed that calculus. With money, you did not need to trust the person. You only needed to trust the currency. A merchant in Rome could buy silk from a trader in China without ever meeting the person who wove the silk, without knowing their name or their language. The money was enough. It was a universal language of value. This enabled specialization on a scale that was previously unimaginable. A person could spend their entire life mastering one craft, one skill, because they could trust that they could trade the fruits of their labor for everything else they needed. The blacksmith did not need to grow food. The farmer did not need to make tools. Each could focus on what they did best, and money would coordinate the exchange. This specialization led to innovation. When people focus deeply on one thing, they find ways to improve it. Better tools, better techniques, better products. And these innovations spread through trade, through the networks that money created. Knowledge flowed along the same routes as goods. Ideas traveled with coins. Money also created incentives. The promise of profit motivated people to take risks, to invest, to create new things. A merchant who successfully brought spices from the East to Europe could become wealthy. This possibility of wealth drove exploration, drove trade, drove the expansion of human horizons. Money turned ambition into a force for economic growth. But we have also seen money's darker effects. It created inequality. In a moneyless society, everyone has roughly the same material conditions. But with money, wealth can accumulate. Some people have much, others have little. And this inequality becomes self-perpetuating. The wealthy can invest their money, earn returns, grow wealthier. The poor, with nothing to invest, stay poor. Money also created new forms of exploitation. Debt slavery, wage labor, systems where people must work for others simply to survive. Before money, exploitation was personal. A slave served a master. But money made exploitation systematic, impersonal, built into the structure of the economy itself. And money funded violence on an unprecedented scale. The wars of the modern era, made possible by the ability of states to tax and borrow, killed millions. The ability to convert economic resources into military power through money made conflict more devastating and more frequent. So money is not a neutral tool. It is a force that amplifies human capacities, both creative and destructive. It enables cooperation and conflict. It builds and destroys. It liberates and enslaves. And perhaps most importantly, money changed how we think about value itself. Before money, value was context-dependent. A bowl of rice has value when you are hungry, no value when you are full. A fur coat has value in winter, less in summer. But money makes value universal and permanent. 10 gold coins are worth 10 gold coins, whether you need them today or tomorrow, whether it is summer or winter. This abstraction of value had profound philosophical implications. It encouraged a way of thinking that reduces everything to numbers, to calculations, to cost and benefit. It made the world seem more predictable, more rational, more subject to human control. But it also made the world colder, more mechanical, less connected to the immediate physical and emotional reality of life. In the end, money transformed humanity from small tribal groups living in harmony with nature into a global civilization of billions, connected by trade, governed by states, driven by the pursuit of wealth. It lifted us out of poverty and subsistence. It gave us art and science and technology. It created the modern world with all its comforts and all its problems. Whether this transformation was good or bad is not for me to say. It simply is. Money changed everything, and there is no going back. We live now in a world completely shaped by money. Our cities, our jobs, our governments, our daily routines, all exist because of and through money. It is the invisible architecture of modern life. We are all part of the money economy, whether we like it or not. We work for money. We buy with money. We save money. We worry about money. It is the constant background hum of existence. And yet, how often do we stop to think about what money really is? How often do we consider its history, its nature, its effects? Most of us use money every day without questioning it. It is so familiar, so ubiquitous, that it becomes invisible. But perhaps understanding money's history can give us a different perspective. It can help us see that money is not natural or inevitable. It is a human invention. And like all human inventions, it can be changed, reformed, reimagined. The problems that money creates, the inequality, the exploitation, the instability, these are not fixed features of reality. They are consequences of how we have chosen to organize our monetary systems. And what has been chosen can be chosen differently. Throughout history, societies have experimented with different forms of money, different rules, different institutions. Some experiments failed. Others succeeded for a time. The evolution of money is not over. It continues today with digital currencies, with new banking regulations, with debates over monetary policy. The future of money is not written. It will be shaped by the choices we make, collectively as a society? Will we create systems that distribute wealth more fairly? Will we find ways to preserve the benefits of money while mitigating its harms? Will we invent entirely new forms of economic organization that we cannot yet imagine? These are questions for you to consider. But for now, as you drift toward sleep, simply reflect on this. Money is the greatest social invention of human history. It is the invisible force that shaped the world you inhabit. It is the reason you live the way you do, surrounded by abundance and technology and global connection. And this is why money changed the world. Quietly, profoundly, forever. A gentle reflection. Before we close, let us return once more to the beginning, to that world before money, to the simplicity of small tribes sharing what they had. There was a beauty in that world, a directness. When you gave something to your neighbor, you saw their face, heard their thanks. When you received help, you knew exactly who helped you. Life was immediate, concrete, human. Money distanced us from that. It made exchange abstract. When you buy something with money, you do not think about the hands that made it, the farmer who grew the grain, the weaver who wove the cloth, the miner who dug the ore. They are invisible to you, and you are invisible to them. Money breaks the personal connection, but it also connected us in new ways. Through money, through trade, your life is linked to people on the other side of the world. The phone in your pocket contains minerals from Africa, components from Asia, software written in America. The coffee you drink was grown in South America, shipped across oceans, roasted in your city. You are connected to thousands of people you will never meet, whose labor improves your life, whose lives are improved by your labor, all coordinated through the medium of money. This is the paradox of money. It isolates and connects. It liberates and constrains. It is both the problem and the solution. And perhaps the wisdom is in understanding this paradox. In not seeing money as purely good or purely evil, but as a tool, powerful and dangerous, that we must learn to use wisely. We cannot uninvent money. We cannot return to the simplicity of the past. But we can, perhaps, shape money's future to create a world that is more just, more sustainable, more human. These are thoughts to carry with you as you rest, as you close your eyes, as you let the day slip away. The history of money is also your history. It is the story of how we became who we are. And understanding that story, understanding how we got here, is the first step toward choosing where we go next. So rest now. Let these ideas settle in your mind like silt settling in a river. Tomorrow, when you wake, you will use money again. You will earn it, spend it, save it. But perhaps you will see it a little differently. Perhaps you will understand that behind every coin, every bill, every digital transaction, there is a long history. A history of human ingenuity and human folly. A history of cooperation and conflict. A history that is still being written. And in that understanding, there is a kind of peace. Because you are part of something larger than yourself. part of a story that stretches back thousands of years and will continue long after you are gone. You are a single thread in the grand fabric of human civilization, connected to all the others through the invisible bonds of money, of trade, of shared value. And that is why money changed the world. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, inexorably reshaping every aspect of human life, creating the world we know. A world of cities and nations and global trade. A world of wealth and poverty. A world of unprecedented complexity and connection. All built on a simple idea. That a small object, a coin, a piece of paper, a number on a screen, can represent value, can be exchanged for anything, can connect strangers across vast distances and across time itself. It is a remarkable idea, perhaps the most remarkable idea humans have ever had, and it changed everything, forever. If you enjoyed this journey through the history of money, if it helped you relax or gave you something to think about, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories to tell, many more quiet journeys through history and ideas. And I would be honored to have you along for them. Thank you for listening. Rest well. And may your dreams be peaceful. Good night.